Preppers. This is showing you just how easy it is to purchase silver without paying any premium over spot price. You just go to sdbullion.com/RP, scroll down and enter the special code to get silver without any premium, and they'll mail it to your mailbox, discreetly packaged. Inside you'll find a beautiful 10-ounce bar of fine silver, and you are able to purchase that and have it and add it to your stack and your collection without paying any premium. And you're supporting Reluctant Preppers along the way. Thanks.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're delighted to have a first-time visitor today. Jim Rawles is the founder and senior editor of Survival Blog, the original prepping and survival blog for when the Schumer hits the fan, SHTF, and he's been doing that since 2005. Jim, thank you for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Thanks for having me on.
Your blog reaches 320,000 unique visitors weekly. It's one of the premier sites among all the top 50 prepping sites, and you engendered quite a bit of activity when we put out a call for questions from our viewers. We've got a long list of viewer questions, and I'll have to be very selective in the ones I toss up there for you, because we've just got more than we can deal with in the time we have. But you've got quite a following and quite a reputation, and we're just delighted to have your experience here. If you could just give us maybe a 1-minute recap of why you started Survival Blog and what you consider your main mission there.
Sure. Well, I consider Survival Blog to be a labor of love. I've been an active prepper since my teenage years, way back in the 1970s. And I look at Survival Blog as the opportunity to wake up people all over the world about the need to prepare themselves and their families for the manifold threats that exist. We live in a very dangerous world. We have a very fragile society, and whether it's terrorism or economic collapse or EMP or X-class solar flare, whatever, or pandemic, there's any number of different things that could happen. And I wanted Survival Blog to be kind of a go-to place for people to gather information about practical, tactical preparedness for their families.
All right. And it certainly has become that and continued to grow. And I'd like to, if you're willing, to just field some of the questions that our viewers at ReluctantPreppers.com, which we have, we're a younger site and much more early in the growth stages, but I have quite a devoted following who are interested in many of the same topics that you're describing there. And I think they'll be highly interested in your perspectives on some of their questions. The first one is one that we get a lot, and it's a theme that comes up with many of the guests we have when we interview them regarding sound money, gold and silver in particular. People often question, why would you be interested in something you can't eat, you can't keep you warm, et cetera, et cetera. They'll start pointing out all the impracticalities and day-to-day, non-common sense uses that you can't use gold and silver for. In fact, here's one, but Dario Nava says, how likely is it that food would or could become a sort of currency or trade item? Being a gold and silver bug, I'd like to consider food as a third currency, even though I could still pay cash, gold, or silver for food if it came down to it. But I'm curious on James's thought about this. I stack gold and silver, but I'm wondering if I could stack those prepackaged long-term food items with 10-plus year shelf life as well.
Well, I am a big believer in precious metals, particularly silver, because as I pointed out in my novel Patriots, gold is actually too compact a form of wealth for practical barter, at least in a post-collapse situation. Because there's so much packed into the value of 1 ounce of gold, there's very few things that you'd be trading for, even with a 1/10 ounce gold coin, where you'd end up with a fair deal.
Right.
But with silver, especially common mint date pre-1965 American silver dimes and quarters, that's just about the right size for a typical barter transaction. So yes, I am a big believer in silver. I'm also a big believer in common caliber ammunition.
Lead bullion?
Yeah, ballistic wampum, as Colonel Cooper used to call it. And I think that people need to have not just a balanced investing portfolio, but a balanced barter portfolio. So they need to have things like junk silver, things like common caliber ammunition, perhaps some food for barter as well. But in the final analysis, what it all comes down to is what you already have on hand for your family's survival. Barter is something that will emerge weeks or perhaps months into a total collapse. You won't have the opportunity to barter if you're hunkered down and there's absolute lawlessness out on the streets. Except for perhaps some barter with your contiguous neighbors, there won't be that many opportunities to barter, in my estimation, in a total collapse.
We've discussed the topic of the safety and security and privacy aspects around bartering when we've had Brad Harris from this Full Spectrum Survival on. Could you talk to us a little bit about how challenging it will likely be to be able to successfully and safely barter while also kind of preserving some anonymity or not revealing the fact that you have, stocks or surpluses, that sort of thing?
It seems like the moment you start to barter, obviously some people are going to know that you have a stockpile. The crucial things are not letting on to how much you have. And you should make it appear that what you're bringing to barter is all that you have to spare. That's a crucial thing. The same thing goes for charity situations where you're dispensing charity. I would recommend that you actually go a step further and dispense charity through a third party, typically through your local church. And the way you do that is contact your church elders and say, hey, I've got some extra food available. I want it to go to people who are truly in need, but I want my name to never be mentioned. And that actually accomplishes two things. First, it protects your privacy and your safety. And second, it fulfills a biblical commandment, which is that the right hand is not to know what the left hand is doing. It's actually biblical to give charitably in an anonymous fashion. And by using a third party, essentially dispensing charity at arm's length, it's going to protect you and your family from the larger community catching on to how much you have available.
Yeah, it's actually safer for your body and safer for your soul.
Right. So I think that it's important that, again, that you have extra on hand for barter and charity, and especially because we really don't know exactly what there'll be shortages of depending on the situation. And you can't, unless you have, a millionaire's budget, you can't anticipate every particular eventuality and stock up on everything that you're going to need. You're going to have to trade for some of that. And if you have things like junk silver, common caliber ammunition, perhaps some 1-gallon cans of kerosene, for example, those are going to be like gold.
You mentioned earlier that it partly depends on how long a disaster or an upset lasts before there is any kind of restoration of normality. And this next question begs that. It says, might the collapse, this is from Irish Jaw 2, might the collapse last for decades? And if so, how can one really prepare for such a long tribulation?
Well, it is possible, especially because we live in a very technologically complex and interdependent society, that if the power grids go down, and they're the real linchpin of modern society, we could see a collapse that could last even generations. We could see a total collapse, essentially a second dark age. And the only way that you're going to get through that is by living in a lightly populated agrarian area where you are well removed from major population centers, you have a plentiful supply of water, and you have access to farmland that's already been broken, where you can do very large-scale gardening and also plant row crops, and hopefully also have a good hay crop, because you're in a really long-term situation. We're going to be reverting to horsepower.
Is it true from your experience that hay does not retain its nutrient value very long in storage? How long can you store hay successfully?
Well, it does start to drop after the first year, but I've heard of people using 2 or even 3-year-old hay regularly, not to any great detriment to horses or cattle. Horses do best with either alfalfa or an alfalfa grass hay mix. Cattle do fine with just grass hay. But regardless, the nutritive value does start to drop. The crucial thing is dry storage for that hay, where it's not going to get damp and moldy, because that's where the real problems come in.
Now, you mentioned briefly there are some aspects of a survivable location, or the place that you want to be for a long term. In your blogging, and I noticed this years ago when I visited your blog for the first time, you actually get pretty specific about, in the United States at least, what regions you consider to be the most optimal for survival in the case of a societal collapse. Can you enlighten our viewers on where that is and why you chose that as your recommended area?
Sure. I coined the term the American Redoubt, and that refers to a 5-state region. It's actually 3 full states and 2 half states, consisting of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, and the eastern half of Oregon and the eastern half of Washington state. That contiguous block of land is probably the safest place anywhere in the continental United States to survive. The reason being, it's a very lightly populated region. There are no major population centers. It's well removed from the coastal population centers. There's very few natural disasters that take place there. It's not earthquake country. It's not tornado country. It's certainly not hurricane country. The only major threat there would be uncontrolled wildfires. I think that the American Redoubt is probably, the safest place that you could choose. And for me and my family, we relocated here many years ago, and we've built up a largely self-sufficient retreat that's surrounded by national forest and has a river running through the back end of it. We're probably in one of the safest places imaginable, and I really feel comfortable here. I have neighbors that I can trust, and even if nothing ever happens, I still feel quite content here, because it's a wonderful place to raise a family. We homeschool our children. The fact that we're 25 miles from the nearest town really doesn't bother us. Again, I'm self-employed, so my situation is unusual, but that's not unique. There's a lot of people who are either self-employed or retired who have the opportunity to move to a region like this. The other region that I would recommend is the Cumberland Plateau, which is in eastern Tennessee and parts of adjoining states. It's in a higher population density area, but it has some of the same attributes of the American Redoubt.
A bit more proximity to nuclear power plants there than where you are, though.
And unfortunately, downwind of a couple.
Yeah. That's
one other advantage of the American Redoubt is the nuclear power plants that we're downwind from are in Japan and China. So,
Yep.
I don't think that's a major threat to us. There's a lot of advantages to the American Redoubt. I do recommend that for any of your viewers who are serious about preparedness, especially for anyone who's concerned about a long-term situation, a grid-down collapse, they got to look very seriously about strategically relocating to an area like the American Redoubt.
You mentioned also access to water supplies, whether it's lakes or rivers or streams, or well water, I guess, is another one. But
the ideal situation is to have gravity-fed spring water, where you literally don't have a pump anywhere in the system. You have a house that's located downhill from a spring and you merely dig trenches and put pipe from a box spring and have it directly service a house. It's a relatively trouble-free system. There's no technology there at all to speak of. And even in an area where you have very low freezing temperatures, as long as you leave one valve anywhere in the house on at a low trickle, the pipes will not freeze.
Right.
The second best, of course, would be well water from a shallow well. And a shallow well is defined as one that is a depth of less than 33 feet. And that 33 feet figure is important because that's 1 atmosphere of pressure, and that's the practical limit for a hand pump, a pitcher-style pump, where the pump cylinder sits at the surface. Here at our ranch, we actually have 3 wells, 1 electric well, and we have backup photovoltaic power for that. And we also have 2, they're also shallow wells that have pitcher-style pumps, and we have those located, 1 right near our house, just off of our deck, and 1 at our main corral, so that we'll always have water available for both our family and for our livestock.
Turning our attention to scenarios and what is most likely to play out in the event of a collapse, we had a question also talking about, do we have examples in the modern world of what our future might look like? Is Venezuela our likely future? Is Venezuela likely the world's worst future? Is Venezuela likely to get even worse? And if so, what does even worse look like at the very bottom? Does it lead to global war, global anarchy, totalitarianism? And it goes on from there. What do you think are the lessons we need to take from Venezuela, and what do you think direction that's going to be heading?
Venezuela is a good example, but I'm hoping that what the United States goes through is something far less, where there's simply a economic crisis, more along the lines of what's happened in Greece or what happened a few years back in Zimbabwe, where they had hyperinflation. I'm hopeful that we only see economic problems and limited societal disruption. Worst case would be something like Venezuela, where they've had both massive inflation and huge societal disruption. And we have not seen the end yet in Venezuela. Unfortunately, the end game there, unless Maduro steps down, will be a complete economic collapse and civil war. And the end game there is not pretty at all.
In terms of, you mentioned a general location where people can find some natural resources that are going to be necessary for long-term survival and the ability to grow food. What about single isolated homestead versus a community, whether that's within a walled fortified area, supporting each other, or whether it's just a loose network of people who are in communication with each other? What do you see as the optimal plan or options that people should at least consider seriously when deciding how isolated they want to be or how connected they want to be?
I think the optimal situation would be to have 5 or 10 acres that's within the city limits of a small town. Because if you have a town with, say, 200 to 500 people, you have a sense of community. You have the we-they paradigm in full operation, meaning anyone who's inside of the geographic bounds of the community is considered part of the we. Anyone outside of those geographical bounds are considered the they. And you definitely want to be on the inside. You want to be on the we side of that equation. With a small town, you have a sense of cohesion. You'll have a division of labor. You'll have a fairly diverse skill set. You're going to have a lot of plumbers, carpenters, a doctor or two. We'll have enough of the crucial skills out there to carry on. If it's an agricultural community, you'll have a lot of people who are already engaged in farming and ranching. That, I think, is the ideal situation. An isolated homestead like I have is in some ways suboptimal. In some situations, like a slow slide or a 1930s style depression or a Greece style economic crisis, an isolated homestead is just fine, especially if you're in a situation where I'm in, where you have neighbors that you can trust. And again, a decent skill set that exists. And in the case of my neighbors, it's really nice to have a neighbor with a very reliable tractor and a bulldozer. That's something I really can't afford myself. And it really doesn't make sense for me to have a tractor and my next door neighbor to have a tractor when I can simply hire him for the tractor work. And in exchange, I would be able to barter any number of different things or any of my skills in exchange for his tractor time. So an isolated homestead is definitely not perfect. And in a total collapse, I might be in a situation where I would actually have to leave here. If we had absolute anarchy, lawless gangs of looters that were constantly roaming the countryside, I wouldn't be able to maintain this retreat for an extended period of time unless I was to hire help. And in that situation, it might actually make sense for me to actually move into town.
The next questions have to do with an alternative to precious metals that we were talking about before, and that's cryptocurrencies. There's a question about whether people should trust the true origin and intentions of them. The question from JM Carp 98 is, are cryptocurrencies a psyops to get us into a cashless society? We do know the internet itself was created by DARPA, and it's not known who created Bitcoin. What is your opinion of the purpose or the promise of cryptocurrencies, and do you encourage preppers to consider them or stay away or somewhere in between?
Well, I have a very small hedge position in Bitcoin, and I don't consider it a viable currency in any kind of crisis, because obviously the internet has to be functioning for it to function. And when everything hits the fan, at the very minimum, people are going to be looking for hard cash and probably even harder precious metals if everything hits the fan. So cryptocurrencies certainly have some utility now, and I don't want to put any predictions in writing on what's going to happen to Bitcoin or to any of Bitcoin's competitors. I've actually been amazed to see Bitcoin do as well as it has. And, I started recommending Bitcoin 8 years ago when it was, $3 or $4 to buy Bitcoin. And the last I checked, it was, $1,100 to buy a Bitcoin. It's been much higher recently, although it's
$4,400 now, yeah.
Yeah, it's all over the map. That's one of the problems with cryptocurrencies is they don't have intrinsic value like precious metals. And anything that has no intrinsic value can simply vanish at the drop of a hat. So I don't recommend taking a position any greater than 4 or 5% of one's net worth in Bitcoin, even for someone serious about Bitcoin.
That's interesting because that's the same factor that Jerry Robinson of Follow the Money Daily mentions. Is he recommends a 5%, and he says he started out that and he has to keep rebalancing his portfolio because it's been growing, outsized gains from that. This is a very different question, and it's one that you can tell us, if you want to refrain from answering, that's fine. The question is quite simple from Mike 2020 Abel is, who runs the American government?
I think the American banking establishment runs the American government. The banksters have basically been in control since the Civil War in this country. And to suggest that anyone else has the real power in this country, I think is naive. We have a system where Congress is beholden to the banks. the Federal Reserve System is a private banking cartel. The U.S. Treasury is essentially a figurehead organization that issues currency, but what they're issuing are Federal Reserve notes, which are a private debt money. We really have no economic freedom or real alternatives in this country because of the Federal Reserve System and because of fractional reserve banking and the continually compounding amounts of debt that have been developed in this country. We really don't have a functioning currency anymore in this country, and we can thank the bankers for that.
This one gets a little bit down to earth from Leslie Peabody. I've been trying to compare wood stoves. I'm more confused than ever. Can you recommend a good wood stove for heating and, more importantly, cooking if the need arises?
Wow. You're really talking two different subjects in terms of heating wood stoves and cooking wood stoves. There's a lot of good brands on the market. I would recommend that folks consult with a company called Obadiah's Wood Stoves. They are up in Montana. I think they're in Troy, Montana. And it's Obadiah's Wood Stoves. And they have a broad line of stoves available. The gentleman who runs that company is named, his family name is Chain, C-H-A-I-N. His first name is Woody. And he's incredibly knowledgeable. He has good prices, and he will not steer you wrong. A lot of people mention we have a restored older cook stove that actually we don't even know the brand of it. But for modern cook stoves, a lot of people mention the stove called the Country Queen as a good brand. But again, talk to Woody Chain at Obadiah's Wood Stoves. And if he doesn't have what you need in stock, he can either order it or refer you to another company. He's very good about that, especially referring people to local suppliers who are outside of shipping distance for his stoves. And
for viewers in the eastern part of the U.S., check out one of our videos, How to Keep Your Family Warm When the Furnace is Out, featuring President and CEO Galen Lehman of Lehman's Hardware, talking about their selections of wood stoves and various considerations for those who are interested. People can look that one up on our channel as well by just searching under furnace. Related question is people talking about food storage. What are your preferred methods? Do you recommend long-term freeze-dried bucket-type food storage, or more rotation of everyday foodstuffs that just have an ordinary shelf life? What are your thoughts when people want to build up a food bank?
I actually believe in all of the above. I think that folks ought to have food in a lot of different categories. If you are a practical, hands-on person on a budget, it makes great sense to stock up yourself using 7-gallon food-grade plastic buckets, HDPE buckets, that are commonly called super pails. A 7-gallon pail will hold over 50 pounds of wheat, for example. And by using Mylar bags and any of the methods for eliminating oxygen from the buckets, typically using either oxygen-absorbing packets or dry ice, you can have bulk grains and legumes that can be stored for many, many years with great success. It's essentially a vermin-proof container unless you have massive rats.
Yeah.
And, you give a rat access to plastic buckets in enough time, they'll
work it through. Yep.
Yeah, but mice don't have any real history of getting into 7-gallon buckets or 5-gallon buckets. So I do believe in stocking up yourself in 5-gallon buckets. Also believe in buying bulk honey in either glass jars or plastic 1-gallon jugs. You should also have a quantity of commercially packed freeze-dried foods just for the sake of variety in your diet. Because if you're eating nothing but wheat, rice, and beans, ad infinitum. It gets really boring, and especially with children, you can get into a situation where children will actually start to lose weight if they have a boring, bland diet. So for the sake of variety, you should also have some freeze-dried foods. And then as for contingency purposes, especially for people who do not live at their retreats year-round, you should also have some retort packaged foods or some military MREs, for example, that are compact, don't require any water to be added, as kind of your get-out-of-Dodge supply of food. So my answer is, again, basically all of the above. You want to have a well-balanced supply of food. You want to supplement that with sprouts. So you want to have a sprouting kit and plenty of sprouting seeds. And also stock up on double encapsulated multivitamins to supplement your food. But if you have a well-balanced diet and you stack your larder deep, you'll be in a great situation where you have enough food for your own family and for barter and charity.
If we could just touch once on that point of charity, you mentioned it briefly in passing before when we were talking about charitable donations at arm's length through a neutral third party. What are your philosophies and beliefs about the obligation and opportunity for people to exercise generosity and charity even in desperate times? As far as, should that be an element that they should prepare and plan for ahead of time to make sure that they have enough extra abundance so that they can do that, and so on? And I assume that part of your mission of your channel, you have been for years spreading the word. So every blog article that you publish is a gift to all the people who read it. So, but go ahead from there.
Thank you. But I do believe in charity. I base that on the Old Testament law of tzedakah. And I believe that as a Christian, I am expected to be charitable. And as I consider my Christian duty, I consider it a good example to my children. I also consider charity to be a community building factor. And I mentioned earlier the we-they paradigm. You don't want to end up on the wrong side of the we/they paradigm. And a great way to get on the wrong side of that equation is to not be charitable or to refuse to barter. So I think charity is very important. My philosophy is to give until it hurts and stock up plenty. Again, you want a deep larder. You want everything stacked deep so you have the opportunity for charity. And again, as I mentioned before, you want to be prepared to dispense charity at arm's length.
Back to the financial topic again. People are asking what you are looking for as signs that would be a precursor signals to a monetary collapse. That's from Steve W.
That's a great question. Obviously, folks should be watching the stock market. They should be watching the U.S. dollar index. I 3 times a week publish an economics and investing column in my blog. And I almost always have links to Forex articles, the foreign exchange market. You do need to watch the U.S. dollar index and the movement of the dollar versus key currencies like the British pound, the euro, and the Swiss franc. Obviously, you're going to watch the stock market and indices. You're going to be watching for any major news about devaluations or monetization of the debt. Presently, the Federal Reserve is making a show of trying to unwind their position of debt obligations, but I think that's mainly just for show. The chances of them completely unwinding those positions are slim because we have a system perpetuated by Congress, the bankers, Wall Street, and the pinnacle of the banking cartel, the Federal Reserve banks, that is addicted to debt. And once they started quantitative easing, which is a form of monetization where essentially you're buying your own garbage paper, once started, the handwriting was on the wall. And at this point, it's just a matter of when we have our emperor has no clothes moment, people realize that the dollar has no real value. And at that point, when people stop trading in dollars, especially when they stop trading oil in dollars, all bets are off.
And that's begun in several locations around the world. Yeah, we've had, again, both Jerry Robinson, Mike Rovero, Rob Kirby talking about that and how those are just big cracks in the foundation of the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. And at some point, yeah, as far as buying our own debt, how we've never had a failed bond auction in the U.S. because there's always a in-house buyer, etc. Here's now we're turning to geopolitical tensions. Cuddy Koala asks, do you believe or see foreign troops occupying America currently or during or after a collapse, or will it just be a matter of having to deal with our neighbors and fellow countrymen?
Hopefully, it'll just be a matter of our own neighbors. The chances of the United States being invaded are very low, in part because of our geographic isolation, but mainly because we have an incredibly well-armed populace. We're one of the most heavily armed countries in the world in terms of civilian firearms ownership. So it'd be very, very difficult, very costly for any foreign nation to occupy our country. It's possible that it could be done by means of nuclear blackmail, where basically folks are told, well, if you try to resist, we're going to start nuking additional cities. And at that point, there might be some capitulation at the personal level where people would actually capitulate to a occupying force and turn in their guns. But I think the chances of that are fairly slim. I think that our main risk really is internal. It's worrying about either the criminal element or the government criminal element, namely our own politicians who get grabby.
And I guess we're running short on time, and so I guess I'll finish up with one that's might take a little bit of time. This is from Irish Jaw 2 saying, this one is purely philosophical, but does humanity have enough humanity to save humanity? Or are we just doomed as a species?
That's a fantastic question. I really like the way that he phrased that. I am a Christian, and I believe that we live in a sinful, fallen world. And knowing human nature, I actually expect the worst. But the good news is, in the long term, I expect the very best, which is the second coming of Christ Jesus. I do believe in the short term that we have the prospect for some very inhumane situations where just we have a very thin veneer of civilization on our society. It doesn't take very much to strip that away. And as I've written and mentioned in many previous interviews, once that thin veneer is stripped away, what's underneath is not very good smelling. We have, it's like peeling the layers back on an onion. It's kind of smelly underneath. And unfortunately, because we have a society that no longer has many moral underpinnings, even if we had a situation identical to the Great Depression of the 1930s, we would see much more societal chaos, much higher crime rate, and just a much more brutal, nasty situation than we had in the 1930s.
Yeah, for multiple reasons, right?
Yeah, we've lost our moral underpinnings as a society. And all I can say is, folks, do your best to stay around folks who are like-minded, who have a strong moral background, because when times get hard, it's mainly going to be the folks who have faith who are still going to be abiding by the rule of law.
Yeah, it seems like there's three dimensions there that all point in protective factors towards what you were talking about as a agrarian, low density location versus, say, look at something like a Los Angeles or New York or something. And you just touched on one of them there, and that's that common moral community. That's one. And number two, the ability to even farm or even know how to grow food. And three is the density itself.
Right. Yes, just the sheer population density alone is going to be a huge detractor. But it will be great if you can be around people who still have a moral framework. And that's one reason I do like the American Braidout, There's still a lot of these little towns have as many bars as they do churches. So you're going to have all sorts of people, but at least it won't be like the big cities where you'll have very few people you can trust.
Well, Jim, before we let you go, this being your first visit here, we always give our guests a chance to share. And in your case, you've already given us about 100 of these, but I'm going to ask it is, can you give us one example, maybe the most recent example of one thing that you have done as a family to make yourself more prepared, more resilient?
Well, most recently, we had our septic tank pumped. And that's one of those things like chimney cleaning that you shouldn't ignore. Because just like you don't want a chimney fire and you don't want a clogged leach field, folks need to think in terms of basic common sense operation of a country property. And one of those is actually having a septic tank pumped once every 4 or 5 years.
Well, Jim, before we let you go, any last thought you'd like to leave with our viewers, and also where they can find your work?
Well, of course, survivalblog.com is my main site. It's been up since 2005. There's almost 40,000 archived articles and letters and column items that are all fully available. It's all fully searchable. There is no paid super secret members only area. It's all there free. Folks, it's there for the taking. So please, copy the most important articles for you, and the really crucial ones you actually should make hard copy printouts and put in binders. Take full advantage of that, folks. It's all there free for the taking. Again, it's survivalblog.com.
Well, Jim Rawles has been with us. He is the senior editor of survivalblog.com. This was his first visit to Reluctant Preppers. We certainly hope it will be the first of many. Jim, thank you so much for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you so much for having me on, and I pray the 91st Psalm for you and all your listeners.
Thank you.